So there they are. It's nighttime. Night has fallen. The people who are in the Fort Detroit, they're sitting there and they're looking out over the big walls of the fort, and they're seeing just like as far as the eye can see all of these campfires, and they're thinking, "Oh no, it's a huge, huge crowd of soldiers. There's so many of them." And then the First Nations peoples, what they do is they get on their horses and they just start making circles, circling around and around Fort Detroit, and like going making all kinds of war noises, and it's loud, and it's like all night long, and they're hearing these horses arriving all night long, and they're just thinking, the people in Fort Detroit are they're really scared. They're like, oh my gosh, there's all of these, like, do you hear the First Nations coming in all night long? I hear more people arriving. It's the same guys coming around again and again and again, but they didn't know that. And in the morning, before even the dawn was breaking, Fort Detroit gave up. They like had the white flag. They rose the white flag. They're like, we don't want to fight you. You can come in. And it was a huge victory for Brock and Tecumseh and for all of the British soldiers, because they ended up being able to take all of the cannons, all the cannonballs, all the gunpowder, all the supplies that Fort Detroit had. They were able to steal all of that stuff away from the Americans, and it made a huge difference in a lot of the fighting, because those the British are now much better equipped than they would have been without that. So there's a whole bunch of different battles here, and I've got them listed for you here. Battle in Queenston Heights, Niagara Falls. There's a bunch of battles in the Niagara Falls area. The Queenston Heights one is the one where Brock he dies, and he dies fighting here. But the Americans lost this battle; they did not win. Um, but there was a whole bunch of other battles. There's this Battle of Stony Brook, Beaver Dams, Chrysler's Farm, Lundy's Lane. These are all different battles that are happening. There's a very famous story about Laura Secord. She is a woman who is living in Niagara Falls at this time. She is a loyalist. Her husband is also a loyalist. They have like 6 kids. They have their farmhouse. And he goes out to fight in one of these battles that I've mentioned, and he becomes injured, quite injured badly. And so the next morning, Laura Secord, goes out and she finds her husband in the battlefield, and she brings him home. She brings him upstairs and she's trying to nurse him back to health. He's wounded. And she's this woman alone with her 6 kids and her hurt husband. And then the Americans arrive, and they've invaded this area, right? There's American soldiers everywhere. And the American soldiers show up at her door, and they're like, you're giving us a place to sleep tonight. We're sleeping here. She doesn't have a choice. She has to open her door and let them in. They've got guns, right? So they're like, we're sleeping over here tonight, and you can make us some food. So she's like, okay. So she's making them food, and they're talking, and they're planning this big surprise attack that they're discussing their tactics. They're going to make this big surprise attack on the British people, and she's hearing all the details of this big surprise attack that they've got planned. And the next morning, she decides she doesn't have a choice. She has to warn the British, because she's a loyalist person herself. So she leaves her husband and her 6 kids, and she puts on her boots, and away she goes. And she walks through the woods, like miles and miles and miles through the woods. And she gets there to the British forces, and she tells them everything that she's heard. And it leads to a major British victory, because they are prepared for the surprise attack. When the surprise attack happens, it's not a surprise, right? So it doesn't work. And the British are able to win that day, and it was because of her contribution. So there's a bunch of different battles and lots of stories surrounding them. Another story of one of the battles is this battle for Toronto. So Toronto is a small town here on the shore, and on the other side of Lake Ontario, it is the United States. So these United States ships that are there in Lake Ontario, they get the 14 ships, they fill it with soldiers, they sail across Lake Ontario, they land in Toronto, and there's a huge battle, and they almost like they burn down a lot of Toronto gets burnt. A lot of people, a lot of civilians are all injured and wounded and hurt, and maybe some people die. Lots of stuff. So it was a low point for the British side, that particular battle. But they made up for it later on in the war, because the British forces went into the United States, and they attacked both Baltimore, and they attacked the White House in Washington, and they successfully burned down the Washington White House. It's burnt to a crisp, but they were not able to take Baltimore. They actually wrote the song about it. How does it go? Star Spangled Banner. I'll sing it to you next video clip.